Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Perkiomen School. I'm Mark Debbie, the head of school. So, I watched something the other day in public speaking, and they said that the energy that you spend normally introducing a lot of things is the worst way to speak because then everybody sort of checks out. So let's get right to the point. Who are we and why are we here today? Well, the answer is simple. Perkiomen School is an independent boarding day school founded in 1875 with a powerful mission that encourages all of our students to risk to be their best self. We know our nation's education system is broken, and at Perkiomen, with a supportive board of trustees and committed faculty, we are unafraid of change and intend to lead and become a role model for other institutions. We look and feel a little bit different. We're a better blend. Perkiomen School is a place of an immersive 360-degree education where the spirit of exploration is infused in every lesson. We're transformative, innovative, global, and diverse. We balance bringing the best of what a liberal arts education can offer, honors and AP classes, a strong visual and fine arts program, highly competitive sports, with forward-thinking opportunities by developing entrepreneur, medical, and artificial intelligence institutes that provide deep learning experiences with partnerships with businesses, universities, and hospitals. We offer students the freedom to pursue their passion and encourage them to recognize opportunities and to take calculated risks. Through that experience, our students learn how to create value wherever they go to achieve that success, whatever they define that to be. We develop trusted relationships, and we build a community that feels like home. In no small way, Perkiomen School's innovative educational model gives our students a competitive edge in their academics, careers, and lives. Our differences are celebrated and cultivated, and our culture is designed to support each student's search for a fulfilling life. So, disrupting education. These yearly symposiums are set up to challenge the way we've done things in the past and to provide new journeys for success. We're bringing together today a group of people who recognize the need to be courageous and discussing the future of education. So the topic of enlightening college admissions. Why this topic? Well, we're trying to re-educate consumers about right fit schools. Success is created by the student, not just the school. And our hope is that college admissions process should shift as we enter the new economy, and it's already shown signs of movement. We know as a high school that we are limited with our ability to shift and change without college leading the way. We want to be sure our kids are accepted. We want to be sure they value who we are. And helping students to showcase their value and skills that don't fit into the traditional application boxes, which may lead to a path that they had never considered. Some may not even lead to college. So now I'm done with my spiel. I'd like to introduce Dave Antonowitz, who's our Director of College Counseling, past president of the Pennsylvania Association for College Admissions Counseling, PACAC, and he's currently the coordinator of the Affiliate President's Council and board member for the National Association of College Admissions Counseling, NACAC. And David is a husband and father of 2 children. He's an excellent golfer, and although he doesn't look the part with blazer and bow tie, in college he was crazy enough to play goalie in lacrosse. So he's unafraid and may have a screw loose. He coaches our boys lacrosse team in the spring here at Perkiomen. Most importantly, David is wise and thoughtful and knowledgeable. He's a leader and a gentleman. So we're glad to have you here this morning, David Antonowitz.
Thank you, Mark. I see that the $20 I slipped you at the beginning of this morning paid off nicely in your accolades. I'm certainly pleased to also welcome you all here today to be a part of today's conversation and to welcome all those of you who are watching us online. When I was approached about turning this year's theme for the Disruptors in Education Symposium towards college admission, I had to think long and hard about what that conversation would look like and who would be the best person to help us lead it. And it was very clear that I had a great keynote speaker in mind. And so it's my pleasure today to introduce that keynote speaker, David Birch. Let's get the clapping out of the way early. David Birch has served as Vice President for Enrollment Management at George Mason University since July of 2015. Before arriving at Mason, he served as Executive Director of Admissions Services at Arizona State University and oversaw the execution of new student enrollment strategy for undergraduate and graduate, domestic and international students. Other professional experiences include the University of Kansas and the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he held senior leadership roles within each institution's Office of Admissions and Scholarships. He is a past president of the National Association for College Admission Counseling, NACAC, a professional organization of more than 15,000 school counselors and college admission professionals. Prior to serving in the NACAC presidential cycle, Mr. Birch served as president of the Great Plains Association for College Admission Counseling, an affiliate of the national organization. He has recently served on a number of panels and sessions focusing on the role and impact of public higher education, the Social Mobility Symposium, TargetX User Conference, and as the welcome speaker at the annual meeting for NACAC. David is a native Kansan. His academic background includes 2 degrees from the University of Kansas, an undergraduate degree in English literature, and a master's degree in educational policy and leadership. Today he will provide us some remarks and a framework for our conversation. Following his keynote remarks, he and I will join in a moderated discussion, and then we will break for lunch. It is now my pleasure to welcome David Birch.
Hey everybody, nice to see you this morning. I'm so excited initially to just simply learn how to pronounce the name of the school. I've known Dave for a couple of years. I've heard him say it. I always seem to roll by it, but it's a privilege to be here. It's my first time here, and it's a great campus, and really great to be here talking with all of you about this topic. I go by Birch, so when you see me later, please feel free. There's a lot of Davids in the world, and so feel free to come up to. I hope we get to chat later on. I'm going to spend just a few minutes welcoming and sort of framing this concept as I see it, but I want to begin by basically saying that hopefully the whole point of what we're going to do today is to disagree with each other a little bit, and out of that sort of creative process of not always seeing eye to eye, we'll arrive at some core truths that will work for all of us. And I thought I would begin by actually telling you my own personal disruption story. All right, and it involves last Thursday, Thanksgiving, I disrupted my family Thanksgiving by burning the heck out of my hand. All right, so I don't know if how many of you did some or all of the cooking at your Thanksgiving? All right, so some of you can relate to this, and I'm sure you're thinking to yourself, oh wow, Birch, you gotta burn if you were cooking. Was there alcohol involved? And I will tell you distinctly, without any reservation, I don't remember. So, no, just kidding. All kidding aside, it was 12 noon, I was wide awake, there was no alcohol involved, it was what you might just call a stupid decision. But it disrupted the entire rest of the day, so I thought I might start by telling that story. So first of all, I'm going to set the scene for you. I'm in Portland, Oregon at my sister-in-law's house, right? So it's a lovely encounter. We've been doing this for about 5 or 6 years. I even only had a couple of responsibilities, right? I only had to do 2 dishes. I did the rolls and I did dressing, not stuffing. dressing. Very important distinction. And so what I did was, and this is where I think the whole thing fell off the rails and how the disruption sort of unfolded. I was in a new kitchen, so I asked my brother-in-law, or I told my brother-in-law, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to cook, and he said to me a very simple question. He said, what pan would you like to use to saute the dressing? And I said, I don't care. And hang on to those words, I don't care. I don't care what pan I use, because it turns out I did care, and I cared a lot more than I ever possibly imagined. So he simply said, oh great, here's the wok. I'll have you cook in the wok, which, fine, it works. It's a big metal dish, it'll get hot, it'll be totally fine. But I don't know how many of you cooked with a wok, and maybe this is not the case with all woks. I never cook with a wok. But it has two handles, right? So it has the long handle, which like a normal human pot has attached to it. And then it has what I'll call the trick handle, right? So the handle that's like really small, that's right up on the edge, that makes it look like it's designed to be picked up with two hands, right? It's not. Just a fun fact. This is spoiler alert, it's not designed to be picked up that way. So I go and I do I'm cooking the dressing, and I get it nice and hot, and I take it and I use two hands on the long handle, and it goes just fine, and I pour it out. And then I make a second batch, because there was a vegetarian there, and they didn't want the sausage, but still have to take the onions and the apples, and you have to saute them, which I did all of that. I then prepare to dump it, and I think, I'm going to innovate, and I'm going to grab it the way it's clearly designed to be grabbed. I grabbed it, and that trick handle actually conducts a lot of heat. And because it's 3 inches, just like 3 inches right away there from the burner. And so, I mean, if you want to see my hand and you have a strong stomach, you certainly can come up to me later. But what I ended up doing is I ended up literally sizzling my hand, okay? And I had the presence of thought to put it down in time, but not the presence of thought to put it down immediately. So there was a moment where I didn't want it to spill, that I actually kind of like set it down gently. Did anybody give me any credit or props for this in the kitchen? No, they did not. All right? All they care is that I set this thing down hard and fast and on a surface that it shouldn't have been set down on. And so, long story short then, is here it is, it's 12 o'clock, we're not eating until 2:30 or 3, and I'm completely without the use of this hand. All right? So I have disrupted my ability to actually prepare elements of Thanksgiving dinner. Now, I promise the story is all worth it, because there's 3 lessons about disruption that I learned in the course of burning my hand. The first is simple. Disruption hurts, okay? And sometimes it hurts really bad. Sometimes it takes that hurt in order to cause the disruption to begin with. Right? So in other words, if you'd have come up to me, my wife or my sister-in-law, and said, hey, we want you to cook the dressing, and we only want you to use one hand to do it, I would have said, I'm not going to do that. Why would I do that? And there's no reason for me to change the way that I have been making this dressing for 10 years, exactly the same, with all of the same ingredients, minus singed flesh, mind you, but I've been doing it the same way. There's no reason for me to change. And my point is this, that when we're talking about disruption, most often disruption happens to us, right? And it takes an event that we may or may not be a part of in order to achieve that type of disruption. So disruption hurts is the first lesson of this parable. And then the second is that the disruption is often done by outsiders. All right? And I think that's actually kind of important for this conversation today. And in this case, right, I'm an outsider in my brother-in-law's kitchen. I am the one who's coming into his space to try to do my job a little bit differently than he might do his job. And as a result, I'm there and I have this destructionist type of disruption that has now changed the face of all of Thanksgiving. And I think all of us, as we do our work, sometimes we are in the situation where we are asked to cause some type of change, and by putting ourselves in that situation, and we're an insider, it's inherently very challenging to do that. For example, like I think about something my president used to say. So the president of Mason until very recently, his name is Angel Cabrera, and he's now the president at Georgia Tech. He, fun fact, I don't know if it's really terribly relevant to the story, but it gets you to know him a little bit better. He's the first president of U.S. university to be born in Spain, right? So he's a Spaniard, came here, ran this university, and he always said the same thing about disruption and innovation, that it's very hard to do within the same vertical from which you come, all right? So in other words, I am an educator, or I'm in education, and I have been for 20 years. I worked in admissions at 4 different public universities. I was taught public university admissions, and then I was taught it again, and then I taught it to other people. My point is I'm in this circle where I'm being taught something and then asked to change it, when the very rules of the road are being defined for me. And how do I then disrupt or become innovative when I don't have that field of view? And so as a result, the best way, or I shouldn't say the best way, perhaps the quickest way, the way that is most often done, is that somebody comes in from the outside and provides a different perspective, and all of a sudden you're dealing with things that are different. The final thing is that the lesson out of this parable is I noticed what happened to everybody else after I burned my hand. Okay, I noticed that everybody else started doing their jobs a little bit differently. Right, so I couldn't make the stuffing, I couldn't finish the stuffing, so my wife had to cover it and put it in the oven. I couldn't do the rolls, and so my wife, or my daughter ended up finishing the rolls. And I guess my point is that in this story of disruption, everybody else's job changed a little bit after everything was disrupted. And that it wasn't a simple matter of, oh, well, Dad has to think differently about how he's going to finish his Thanksgiving responsibilities, or someone will simply slide right in and do it exactly the same way that Dad has been doing it. No, everybody else had to kind of adapt and adjust. And I think about this story a lot. I don't know if you've heard of it. Did any of you know the deal with bananas? Right? Do you know the deal with bananas? So like I had a banana on the way in. I love bananas. Did you know that the bananas we eat today are not the same bananas that people ate even 50 years ago? I didn't know that. Like, it blew my mind. I was like watching Vice or some other terrifying news story that just shakes my worldview. And so it's called I had the net word here. I want to say it's like the Cambridge banana.
Cavendish.
Cavendish banana. Thank you very much. Thank God you were here. So basically, this banana wasn't even invented until like 1836, right? It was developed, it was cultivated, and it didn't start hitting really wide scale until the 1950s. All right, and it's because there was a blight and there was a disease. I think it's called like the Panama fungus or something along those lines. If there are science teachers in the room, please feel free to correct me on any misstatement I make. But my point is that in the disruption story as it relates to bananas, right? I think there's a lot of different elements of my own disruption story, which is that in the process in the 1950s of sort of deconstructing this old banana culture around this old type of banana, there was a lot of hurt, and there was a lot of influence from outsiders, and in this case, it affected everybody else, right? So in other words, not only is the blight that affects sort of one part of the world affecting banana production, but it is also affecting the people who are kind of wrapped around that. And I think the reason I sort of begin my remarks today talking about this relatively silly story and connecting it to large-scale agriculture is that I guess I want to help all of us think, when we are thinking about disruption, that we're thinking about it in the same way. Because disruption, in a very basic sense, is taking something that you've done already, an event, a process, and then you are forced to do it differently somehow. And the simple act of being forced to do something differently is neither good or bad. It just is. But the effects of that type of disruption can be good or bad depending on how we choose to process it and how we choose to react to it. And that then relates to this larger, more of a business concept of disruptive innovation. Okay, and disruptive innovation, it seems like we hear this a lot, right? I mean, these are buzzwords, these are the products of our time: disrupt, innovation, make the world a better place through tech and things like that. So disruptive innovation as a concept didn't come around until the mid-90s, right? And a lot of it seems to focus on tech. Right? I love that we're today kind of talking about disruption in a more global sense, because actually tech is not inherently disruptive by itself, but rather it is only disruptive in the sense that it allows us to do other parts of the business differently. So in the college admissions world, right, having an online application in and of itself is not terribly disruptive. Right? We've done that for 20 years. It's been concept. It's not changing anything. 10, 15 years ago, when some of us said, we're no longer going to take the paper application and we're only going to take the electronic, that's disruption. That is the changing of the game. An example of this that comes up in industry, right, is cars, right? So some would say, oh, well, the invention of the automobile was a disruptive bit of technology. Well, not for 30 years after it first rolled off the line, it wasn't. Because when cars first came around, they were only targeted at the uber wealthy, right? So they were people who could afford a super expensive, it's almost like the Tesla used to be, right? So you wanted a Tesla, you had to shell out 80 grand, 100 grand, and it was a niche. It wasn't really going after an existing market, maybe the Mercedes or the Audis or the luxury market. But people like me, people like, I'm going to guess many or most of us in this room, we're not going to go off and we're going to spend that type of money. The same was true with Henry Ford, until he rolled off an inexpensive car that could compete against horse-drawn vehicles. As soon as it was an apples-to-apples comparison, that's the moment disruption occurred. Which I think is interesting as we kind of consider ourselves today, which is that maybe we're not waiting for the next disruptive bit of technology, but whether we're waiting for an existing bit of technology to be applied to change the business model in order to change education. And I often wonder about this, as I think about this, as we all perhaps feel the weight of this in our pocket, right? This phone, when the iPhone came out, it was pretty revolutionary, right? I think we all had that moment of like, wow, I can do all this on my phone. But with each iPhone that comes out, I find myself wondering the same thing over and over again. What's really different other than the fact that I'm paying for it again? And the fact that my old one is really slow and probably has a cracked screen. And I guess that's what I'm saying is that the technology and the types of things we can do with the phone aren't necessarily changing on or changed 10 years ago and then have been slowly changing since. But what we do with it absolutely can mark what would be a disruptive bit of activity. I think, too, another example of this comes from the change that happened when Steve Jobs and Wozniak created the first computer in that garage. Which, by the way, have you been to Walt Disney World lately? Do you know that they're in the Epcot Center, like right next to Gutenberg's Bible and things like that? It is really insane to think that type of world change, global and life-altering, humanity-altering change happened, and now you can see it as part of a Disney ride. But my point is that you've got, they made that change, but it really wasn't until 10, 20 years after that they made that change, before the true disruption started occurring, and before people started doing things with the machine and with the technology to make it different. And I submit this to you before launching into sort of what I see as some of our major challenges and how we can enlighten admissions in the course of the next 10 to 20 years, because I honestly think that we are, if you're sitting in this room, you're outsider enough to cause some sort of disruption. You're certainly outsider enough to be affected by some kind of disruption. You likely have the tools to do that type of disruption in your own world, meaning your own professional environment, and that there are likely others like yourself who are seeking to do and make that kind of change. It doesn't just happen to us, we kind of collectively, we work on that together. And so with that as the framework, right, with that as the idea that hopefully you can see yourself within this type of world, I look at what we have to, the reasons that we have to enlighten the college admissions process as being nothing short of national importance as it relates to sort of the national, not only our national security, our national economic policy, just even, I think, human civilization somewhat is dependent upon our ability to get this right. And I worry right now because the income gap that exists between rich and poor is the biggest that it's been in almost 100 years, right? The number of students going to school might be improving, but the number of poor kids going to school, that's not improving. Right now, the relative value of earning a college degree has been called into question, right? Like there are people who say that this is not of the same value that it was before. The basic assumptions of higher education as a propellant of social mobility, that same assumption that defined not only my generation, I'm going to guess the generation of the majority of you in this room, but even the generation before me, that's been labeled as a partisan idea, that somehow that is a form of indoctrination. The college costs are rising faster than either federal or state governments will fund the difference. And right now, the low-income and middle-income student participation in higher education is either stagnant or dropping. I'm going to prove all of this. I'll give you citations for all of this. I'm sure you're dying to look them up afterwards. So you know, the Pell Institute put out a paper back in 2018, and basically they said, quote, "The concentration of wealth is now approaching the high rates observed during the Great Depression in the late 1920s. And that concept in and of itself is frightening enough. So if you think about the social tension that erupted in the 30s and the 40s, and you think about where we are today, in terms of access to information and the ability to organize and the ability to have what I would call unproductive disruption through a few clicks, it's actually a terrifying concept. That same paper really pointed out something terrifying to this, and I'm sure some of you can relate to this personally, that 3 out of every 4 high school graduates from the highest family income quartile enrolled in college shortly after leaving high school. I mean, for those of us who are in this room, that's a big, well, duh. Yeah, of course. So the wealthy kids, 3 out of 4 of them, are leaving straight from high school and going straight into college. Now, they may have their own set of challenges along the way, and I don't want to discount those challenges. However, it's very clear that these students don't have difficulty making that leap and then eventually getting out of school. Now, this is in contrast, let's say, to those that are in the bottom quartile, right? So the National Center for Educational Statistics, which is something, if you're a big nerd like me, go to NCS and have a little fun with data and charts and graphs. You can see that the lowest income students are far less likely to earn a bachelor degrees. In fact, the high income students are 4 times more likely to do that. So the established process is the need of disruption with this information is the ability to get more low-income students, middle-income students into good colleges with good degrees in order to be able to go out into the world and produce. And that in and of itself is a challenge. Like just that's a national level challenge as we consider the systems that we've built along the way to do it. And some people would say, some colleges would say, and they'd be wrong, is that that's a K-12 problem, right? That the reason these students are not going on to college is because that they are poorly prepared, using bad grammar, for example. And I guess the reason I don't buy that is because every year there are 250,000 students from the lowest income quartile who are also in the top half of their graduating class who don't go to college. These are students that have some degree of preparation. These are students who could fit somewhere. These are students who could probably be successful at some institutions that are labeled as elite, but they're not going. And I think when we think about how the system would need to be disrupted, we need to ask ourselves, how does our actions, the actions on the college side and the admissions process, how is the school counseling side, how is the community-based organization side, how are they organized in order to make sure that these students don't fall through the cracks? And I know that there's a common argument that there, again, like I mentioned earlier, that college degree is not as valuable as it was before. And I think, actually, back to a compelling piece of data that came out of Georgetown, which looked at the jobs pre-Great Recession and post-Great Recession. And the upside is that a lot of the jobs that were lost during the Great Recession, the number of jobs came back, right? So we're adding lots and lots of jobs now. The difference is, though, that of the 11 million new jobs created since 2011, fewer than 100,000 according to Georgetown, are for those who don't have a college degree, right? Meaning automation, sort of outsourcing in terms of moving things off country, changes to things like mining and things that are very relevant in communities not too far from here are resulting in a different type of economy. And sooner or later, these students are going to need that college degree. Even if they can make a good wage now, being able to make a good wage in 30 to 50 years is going to be more challenging. And so what happens here is that we have this gap it's not just about rich and poor, right? It's about power. It's about privilege. And it's about those who have access to some of these things and those who do not. This varsity blues scandal, right? Like, I know we've all had, sometimes we've had tears and sometimes we've had laughs, and but in the end, this idea that there are parents out there who are willing to pay a price to get their student into a, quote, good school surprised nobody, right? Nobody who does this work. And the people who do this work know that type of inequality exists everywhere, whether it's access to great school counseling, which not everybody has, or access to college prep or test prep services, which very few actually have. And so if we built a system that is going to be self-fulfilling and self-cycling, then sooner or later it's going to back up on us. Because if you look at the positions of influence, right, the positions that require real change and do really move things around in this country, all of those require some level of college degree. I think about this, there's a study that was done of 12,000 influential business leaders, CEOs, judges, politicians, et cetera, and it was observed that all 12,000 of these who were deemed successful individuals, 94% of them attended college. Yeah, Zuckerberg didn't, but so what? Yeah, Gates didn't, but these types of things are exceptions. For people who are going to move in to become the new heads of school, or going to become the new mayors, or dukes, depending on how it's, or I should say the duke is the spouse of the mayor, my apology. These people are going to need some level of college degree. And right now, the number of college students is declining. Right? And there's this idea out there of what's happening in the next 15 to 20 years, this enrollment apocalypse, as people in my line of work like to call it, which would be the number of traditional students who are coming through and going to college, a lot of them being these 3 out of 4 of the high income group. That group is shrinking over the course of the next 15 years. And people are terrified about what people like me are going to do to try to maintain my piece of that pie. What are enrollment leaders and admissions officers going to do in order to assure that they can get their bottom lines met? And I think there's reason to be legitimately concerned about that. But I think the reasons to be legitimately concerned about that have existed for decades, which is why we've been catering to this wealthy group of relatively high achieving students. There has been this slow parade, sometimes not so slow, of capable, talented, low-income students who simply are not getting served. And we have to figure out how to serve them. And even if they're not in our alpha, or even if they're not in the historical enrollment profiles of our institutions of higher learning, we absolutely have to do that. The idea here is that we would do something different, that it would hurt, and that it would cause all of us to think differently about the work that we do. Because if all we're really talking about is shuffling the chairs on the deck, right? If we're still just as focused on the same limited number of selective institutions and the limited number of spots that those institutions offer, well, then I think we're missing the larger opportunity here. I don't know if this is actually true, but I heard this quote from, it was accredited to Rahm Emanuel, who basically said, let's not let a good crisis go to waste. And I think that's where we are. Let's not let a good crisis go to waste in terms of heading towards something that could be very catastrophic. But if we think differently and we start to process our world differently collectively, then I think we have the opportunity to actually turn some of those things around. Because when you look at the last 20 and 30 years, the number of seats that have grown in these ultra-selective institutions, those seats tend to go to the wealthier kids. They don't tend to go to the lower income kids. They don't tend to go to students from a community college. And right now, right or wrong, that's where the American dream of education actually lives, at scale. At scale. Every university will talk to me about the percentage of Pell students they have, which I think is interesting. Always ask them what's your end count on that, by the way? Because you can have 30% of a class of 300, and that's not very many. In the case of Mason, we've got 30% of a class of 4,000, so we're talking thousands of Pell students. And we're not satisfied with that, because we know that there are talented students that exist that are not going to college. This is not a pro-Mason message. This is just simply an example of institutions of a certain type that are actually kind of trying to take a swing at this and say that we're going to try to get more low-income students, and we're going to try to figure out a sustainable business model all at the same time. Because what's frightening, right, is that some people will say, okay, well, the public university mission, that's where the poor kids should go to school, right? That's where they should do that, because that's what it was built to do. I mean, at first I could spend an afternoon on why I don't think that's true, but let's assume that is true for a moment. The same thing that is happening at some of these ultra-selective institutions are also happening at the flagship public universities as well. And in the National College Access Network, they compared the neediest students at the top 550 public four-year institutions with residential campuses, and they actually found that the low-income students could only afford 139 of those 550. Right? So the access problem is not just about getting the offer of admission. Right? It's about figuring out how to fund the thing. Why do you? To me, I'm fascinated as in a little bit more than sports these days in the presidential competition going on right now. And I say competition because that's the way the media is portraying it to us. It's a reality show to see who's going to, and that worked out so well last time. I'll be curious to see who can actually thrive in that environment. But if you look almost to a person on that stage, on the Democratic side anyway, they're pitching some sort of idea around college costs. And I think it's going to be hard to weigh those ideas and compare those ideas against one another, because some of them are so disruptive and are so different. But the need case couldn't be more clear for not just changing the way we do admissions, but the way that we actually fund the students who come through. And FIT oftentimes doesn't live in the area where you can be successful at a university or a college. But FIT lives in the areas where you can afford it. And I don't even mean afford it with some debt, because all students should expect to carry some debt with them. Every single student. My wife would say that builds character. And I'm still, the CPA father in me says all debt is bad. But nonetheless, it is definitely something that students should get in touch with. But these ideas of students being boxed out of flagship public universities mean that they can't afford the price tag to begin with. So let's talk about sort of the happy side of that. I've been rather gloom and doom here for a few minutes, talking about burned hands and catastrophic societal failures. But I do think there's something that we can do together to collectively make this happen. I think that actually we have to change the way we talk about college. This is just me. This is what I hope you kind of push back on later in the day. But I think we change the way that we talk about college affordability and the outcomes. And again, I would say that America doesn't necessarily have a college going problem quite yet. They've got a college completion problem for sure. Whether you look at, I'll drop on the Mason example here. So Mason is in Fairfax, Virginia, just outside of DC, has an Arlington campus and a campus in Manassas, and it serves the entire DC, on the Virginia side of the DC area. And there was a very public competition to see who would host the Amazon second headquarters, right? You might remember this. And there was a lot of discussion and debate about where they would do this, and they eventually decided that they would do it in Northern Virginia as well as New York. That fell apart in New York. But the Virginia deal remains strong. And what they said when they made the choice was that the ability of the region's institutions of higher learning to produce talent that could work at an Amazon was a big part of that decision. Yes, they had to have the office buildings. Yes, they had to have the housing. All of those things had to be present. But you have to have people to fill those jobs. And the people to fill those jobs need to be trained and need to be ready to go into that type of work. And so as a result, if we sort of change, I think if we change the way that we talk about that outcomes piece, and we talk about the way we talk about the conversations of affordability, and not talk about them as independent from one another, but rather link them all together. My organization, Dave's organization, I know many of you are NACAC members in this room, that there was actually a formal memo issued by the membership in the Current Trends and Future Issues Committee that more or less highlighted this point and said we have to focus on figuring out ways to talk to students about those costs with the same veracity that we figure out the way to talk to those universities about lowering those costs, right? If we talk about them as three separate conversations, we're unlikely to fail, or we are unlikely to succeed. And there's actually some research on this topic, right? There's research on that if you talk to a low-income student and you mention debt without mentioning the outcomes and the job potential that goes along with that, then they're likely to do what my children are very inclined to do. I've worked in this business for 20 years. I've got a 17-year-old at home who lectures me about college debt and says how she doesn't want to go to college because she doesn't want to assume the debt. And this is a young lady of privilege, I assure you. This is a young lady who grew up in a middle-class household with two college-educated parents, and they are working hard to try to understand this idea of debt. And I know you see this, right? I know you live this more than I live this, when you have families coming in sort of that are debt averse and not really putting two and two together as it relates to the success that comes with going to college and the debt that one assumes, especially, and when you get into the data on this, it hits our underrepresented population students the hardest. Specifically, the data would point to our Hispanic students as being particularly hard hit by this idea of linking debt and outcomes when it comes to college. And it requires a much deeper level of focus. The second thing I think we have to kind of change and think about is our how we view the transfer process, both in terms of how we view the students who go that route and the colleges who accept the students from that route. All right. So first of all, colleges do a lousy job, writ large, of being welcoming to transfer students. Right. So I've worked at 4 different universities. 2 I would say are I would give them C pluses in terms of dealing with transfer students, and 2 of them I would give D minuses or perhaps even Fs. And the great way to make this calculation is looking at the number of transfer students that this institution actually brings in. Okay. And as counselors, as people who advise people on this process, sometimes I feel as though that can be perceived as a negative. Right? If a university has a lot of transfer students, is that really such a good thing in terms of the reputational value of that institution? And I would maintain that it is. It is a strong indicator of value. And I think about the number of underrepresented students that come in via transfer pathways. I think about the number of poor students that come into transfer pathways, disabled students, veteran students who come in through these, and that makes a difference in the classroom environment. We're going to talk about disrupting education in a broader sense outside of admissions. The classroom is the place most ripe for disruption. And the credential that we assign to that classroom work is ripe for disruption. And so if we, as a collective, start to see transfer students differently as an asset, as making up something more than just a way to, I think all too often enrollment managers look at them as ways to fill the gaps between what their freshman class couldn't do. And that's repugnant to me, right? I think it is actually the kind of thing where we literally have millions of students in the community college system who are locked. I heard a terrifying stat. I don't know if any of you are and then again, I'm going to credit it to John Bockenstead. I don't know if you know who this is. John Bockenstead, super big brain in college admissions, now working at Oregon State in the enrollment management position. He worked in Chicago for a number of years. I was on a panel with him, and he said, at any given time, 11% of all U.S. college students, undergraduates, 11% of all U.S. undergraduates are in the California community college system. One system, 1 out of 10 institutions in American higher ed. You add Texas into that mix, that number goes all the way up to 14% of all students. Now couple that stat with a stat that I know we've all heard, that only about 20%, maybe even 15% of those who started a 2-year end up earning a 4-year degree. That's on colleges to fix, period. One, we have to be more open to those institutions, to students who are transferring in our admissions process. Again, an enlightened admissions process acknowledges a winding path to get to a degree. And two, we have to make that process less onerous. I would feel reluctant if I'm a school counselor to recommend a community college transfer when I know how hard it is to actually take those credits from one institution and apply them at another and graduate in a timely manner. And if you just look at the number of state governments who have somehow gotten involved in things like course numbering and course content and the creation of a core curriculum, it's emblematic of a failure that I think is ripe for a type of disruption, or at the very least is ripe for a way to change the model of how things work. So I hope that we collectively could talk about the role of community college transfer in this college admissions process, because if we're talking about changing something at scale, that's the fastest route to scale that we have. Ask Lumina. I mean, Lumina will talk to you about the 3 million plus, individuals at various ages who have some college credit but don't have a college degree. I mean, like, that's a group in the college admissions process that is invisible, right? Very hard to find, very hard to see, and just as easily as lost as they are found. So today, what I want to do with all of you is I want to tie one hand behind my back, less burned and mangled than it was before. I want to talk about what it means to change the admissions process to become not just more open to a different type of student, which I think is an admirable goal, but how do we change the admissions process to solve all of the things that we need to solve for in terms of the students that we're losing? And I know we can do it. I know we can do it because there are pockets of immense success all around us. There are pockets of success in this room, I guarantee it. And if we can somehow put our heads together around how that might be different, then I know that there will be a positive outcome for students. And I know, because I've been doing this work long enough, that that's why you're sitting in these seats today. And I want to thank you for giving so generously your time and your talents to this important conversation. And I want to thank our hosts for allowing us to do that. So thank you, and I look forward to talking with you soon. Do I stay up here?
Sure. All right, great. So I do want to thank David for setting the framework of today and for sharing those remarks. So let's have another round of applause.
I can't clap for obvious reasons.
Just so you know. Certainly during your remarks, I was furiously scribbling notes, and I can't even read my own handwriting. So please bear with me. You introduced a number of different topics: access, affordability, the value proposition of college. Where do we start?
Well, it's interesting you say that. I had a conversation with my oldest child yesterday on the topic of anxiety, and one of the things that they wrestle with is that idea of when there is so much to do, where do you begin? And I think that's so in this anxious world of trying to do something big like this, it's a very natural conclusion. My first point is simply we have to start somewhere. And I would say to the individuals that are here and to myself, you begin where you are, and you begin with what you can control. And I know we can't control everything. I am fortunate to have come to a place in my career where I can make some strategic choices about who we get admitted and how much aid that we provide students and how that aid is distributed and maintained over time. I did not have that power even 5 years ago. And so some of it has to do with sort of staying the course, too, is to not only finding the places where you can make that change now, whether it's providing a level of counsel to a student that is a little bit more thoughtful, or providing counsel around an institution that takes a broader view than selectivity metrics. But then the other part of it is saying, how can you then find the right seat on the bus to make the type of changes that you want? Which is always interesting, too, for me. I don't know how the rest of you feel about this. It's never quite as easy as it sounds once you occupy that seat of power. There are tremendous forces that are kind of working like this sort of deep state of what the way we've always done it before that you have to kind of overcome. In a global sense, taking it out of the context of us as individuals, we have to grow our freshman classes, period. Like we have to. We have to admit more students. We have to become less reliant on the ultra-selective as sort of the coin of the realm. And we have to do that through thoughtful growth exercise, right? So a Mason who has grown from 33,000 to 38,000 in 5 years needs to grow that much again. A university, I'll try not to list other universities that I know are shrinking right now, need to turn that around and say, we have to sort of unleash our full potential on a greater scale of people. And to not see that as diminishing quality, but rather see it as expanding that value proposition to a larger base.
Fair, although I don't think you answered my question.
Okay, hit me with it. Where do we start?
So, say colleges and high schools were on board right away.
Okay.
Right? Everybody's on the same page. How do you first sell that to the public? Right? If we're going to transform this deep-rooted notion that you can only be successful if you go to one of these top-tier institutions, these ultra-selective, and that we've heard students are very willing to take out debt to go to these places, but maybe not as willing to take out the same amount of debt to go to schools that don't have that similar reputation.
Sure.
Where do you start that battle?
Okay, so I would take it on two fronts. All right, so the first front is on the college side, which colleges have to do something about costs, like period, right there. I mean, if you just look at I paid for 15 credit hours at the University of Kansas in 1993. I paid $900 for a semester. And now that is, it's okay to laugh and cry all at the same time, right? So if I put that sort of on the scale now, and I don't know what KU's tuition is right now, but let's assume it's similar to Mason's in-state tuition, that's going to be 10 times the cost of what it was before. The services, are a little bit different. I don't think the reason that the costs are going up are exclusively because we're offering lazy rivers or exclusively because the state has divested themselves, but I know that those things have contributed to that. So if colleges could come up with an option that allows them to deliver the same quality in a different way, in a less expensive way, I think that's the first place, and that's where the universities have to start. On the advising side, let me poll the audience here real quick. How many of you, I'm going to make the assumption that most of you have said a phrase similar to what I'm about to say, which is that selectivity is not a surrogate for rigor, right? I make the assumption that literally every school counselor has said at some point in time to some student, probably within the last month, stop looking at how hard it is to get into these places, and somehow that determines how good that place is. So I don't want to give the impression that we haven't been trying to kind of counteract that narrative, because I think as a collective, if you haven't been doing that, I'd encourage you to think about starting doing that. And talking to some of the people who have their hands in the air about some good tactics, because I know those things don't always get received very well. But I think, too, that idea of de-emphasizing some of the rankings and de-emphasizing some of things like the selectivity as a surrogate for rigor is a place where we have to begin. In the end, I think we have to leverage our own positions when we have a big bully pulpit, right? So I try to work in, every time I'm talking to a media source, that line. The selectivity is not a surrogate for rigor. I don't care if we're talking about financial aid or if we're talking about something else. I try to work in that line because in the end, we're swimming upstream against a media narrative that is incredibly hard to change. And if anything, I think things like Varsity Blues make it harder for us because it in essence says, this is what we've all known all along, and this is how it works, and these are the better schools, and this is why, and look, there's a dollar figure actually associated with these better schools that somehow magically will change our lives in certain ways. So if we take these small battles and find them ways to make them big battles, that's the place to start. But there is no silver bullet on this, I don't think.
No, and certainly for our students, it's not a one-size-fits-all. either, with students having different interests and passions and needs coming from their education.
Absolutely.
Touching upon the Amazon example that you gave in your speech, we've heard different reports. Colleges don't think students are prepared for college. Industry doesn't think students are prepared for industry.
Sure.
How do we reconcile those things? And who has to make the first move? Is it high schools? Is it colleges? Or is it industry adjusting to meet what students are being produced as?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. So I don't want to absolve the high schools of any responsibility. It's not necessarily my area of expertise other than evaluating high school credentials. Right? So as someone who's evaluated high school credentials for years, though, I would say that universities are making a choice not to serve a certain subset of students. That's an actual decision they're making by throttling the size of their class, by refusing to offer remediation, by refusing to offer alternative pathways, by refusing to acknowledge credit transfer as a legitimate and equitable part of the transition process. So the lion's share of this falls on the colleges and the universities to, one, change the definition of what it means to be prepared for their institutions. That is not synonymous for lowering standards. Right? That's always, whenever I say things like that, people, I think, and a certain cohort of people who look at it and say, well, we're not going to water down our standards just to try to include a few more people. To which I say, don't water down your standards, but at the same time, reconsider if your standards ever really measured what you thought they did. And I would say that they didn't. That they instead measured the amount of privilege that students have when they're going through to these ultra-selected institutions. And instead say to yourself, how can I build bridge programs as an institution that in fact make us more accepting and welcoming, and not even just welcoming, better prepare students for the success that undoubtedly awaits them. So that's number one. Let's get bigger. I mean, if we're gonna have to get simple and stupid, let's get bigger, everybody. The second thing is that let's get better in the ways that we actually link the instruction with the career outcomes. And that is not code for technical training, right? I mean, if you look at this and you say, look, what does Amazon need? Yes, Amazon needs a lot of things, right? Amazon needs just as many people to code as they do to build marketing plans. And what everything we're hearing out of industry is that they are far more willing to educate their students than we ever thought they were, because what they realize is that what they need are lifelong thinkers. They don't need people who are familiar in the source code of today. They need to have people who can be thoughtful and project forward and evolve and change as the company's needs evolve and change. Because right now, Amazon is built, and to a certain extent is being run by people who were formed in educational point of view before the technology that founds the company even existed. Right? Anybody who is above the age of 40 there remembers a time when they didn't have a computer in their house, right? And so as a result, the people that they've attracted and have made successful in the company are people who have that growth mindset and who can help grow and evolve with the company and have the skills to do that. So I think, but what the challenge there on the college side is that sometimes that's a dirty word, especially among certain sectors of the faculty, who would say that, no, we teach what we teach, we know that this is the right way to do it, and the companies are saying, well, that's right, and you have the right to do that, but when they get to us, they're not successful because they're not learning this, that, or the other. So when you see certain things like the rise of micro-credentials, I think that's interesting in terms of retooling. But I believe that it's still in the liberal arts where we have to grow the number of students who are learning how to exist and think, even in the 21st century when we're all too keen on saying that the rules have been rewritten.
You touch on a few things that I think we've really embraced here in Brigham School with our institute model, knowing that we're preparing students for uncertain futures, for careers that don't even exist yet, and how can we prepare them here to be successful in using your example of growing up in a home without a computer and how everything works on computers. We've started to take that challenge on and develop some opportunities for students to create the value that they want to see in themselves and in the world around them. how do I tell them how to put that in your college admissions application?
That's a tough one. On the Mason side, it's easy. We admit 80% of the students who apply. We're proud of that, right? You'd have to really be an outlier in terms of, you'd have to take some strong steps to avoid that. If you're in a more authentically holistic reviewed process, right, which is to say that you have complete confidence that your file is being read and reread and given weight to things that are not objective, like what I think you're talking about. I think you're talking about an experiential advantage to it, right? Which I completely buy. And I'm sure you're documenting that in your school profile as well. But in the end, I think that even if you do what you're suggesting, and maybe your student is given sort of the attention that they need and deserve to get that offer of admission, they're still taking that offer away from somebody else, unless we're growing as a vertical, right? Like, so in other words, maybe that's one of the things that I would suggest we ought to think about evolving and changing, is to say, is there a more holistic view that factors in everybody's students, which is hard. Like, I don't care about the UVA students the same way I care about the Mason students, the same way you don't care about who's your biggest competitor. Like, who's your rival? Who do we rival against here? No rival. We are unrivaled here at this school. Either way, so we're worried about other students at other institutions, because in the end, I think we've tried a lot of different types of innovation. I mean, I think even, I'm going to say what is probably a dirty word, the coalition app, right? I think was actually born out of an idea, not really born, I know the idea was born out of, but one of the side benefits that we use to justify it, of trying to provide a deeper look inside a student's academic record is like, that's a noble idea. But it only works if indeed I can look at your record and make a determination about your ability to succeed, and not then take away mine as a result of privileging you in that process. And that's what I don't know how to do quite yet, right? Not without the colleges playing along nicely.
So things like the coalition application, the common application,
Sure.
were designed to, in one hand, just standardize the process.
Sure.
Is it worth exploring the idea of blowing those up and going back to each college, asking the students to articulate what value they express, and seeing where that matches the value that the college is looking for?
I think it's an interesting idea. Another way to blow that up is to approach it like law school. Instead of saying, hey, so it's almost saying, hey, there's only the Common App, right? There is one process by which we sort of submit these materials. At the very least is that we initiate the process. And I think at that point, when we have a really robust data set, right? I mean, so imagine a world where instead of Common App being 900 of the institutions of higher learning, there are actually 4,000 or 3,500 or whatever the official count is of institutions of higher learning. And then sort of the data analysis that we could do across institutions, I would argue it's our siloed nature that keeps us from moving forward right now. Because I know things, you know things, but do we know things that actually make it better? And how do you then take that ability to maybe unlock the process utilizing big data across institutions, and still allow the individuality that exists within a college, right? Because we can't, in all the media that I would ever do on Varsity Blues, it would always start the same. They would always describe the college admissions process as if it was one thing. School counselors, how much of your work is simply running interference for some bonehead things that colleges do in the name of their own application or their own prompt or whatever that. I mean, I think we've got I'm not going to call it a cottage industry. We have an industry built that is just trying to untangle the knots. What if some level of nationalization, I'm not advocating for that at the federal government level, but rather some sort of collective work together through NACAC, through Common App, where we actually build something upon which we can all mutually benefit in exactly the same way. And another pet project of mine, and this has got some media play lately, would be the revenue generation based off of lead acquisitions. Now, for you on the high school side, I assume you know about this, but maybe you don't. But I spend hundreds of thousands of dollars every year buying your students' names. Explaining this to my daughter, who recently filled out an EduVenture survey, and I said, oh, well, congratulations, your mailbox is going to blow up tomorrow. And she's like, oh, no, that was just a survey. Like, oh, well, we'll see. And lo and behold, 50 colleges are emailing her a week later because that form that cost my daughter nothing, that maybe cost you your time to administer in the classroom, is now being sold at a profit. And College Board has got $1 billion in revenue, and universities' marketing and advertising budgets just are growing and growing and growing. That's what I'd love to deconstruct through a centralized service. What if we didn't have to pay for that anymore? What if we focused more on how do we get your students fit to the right place, instead of how do I go and wrestle to get their attention? Which is a fool's errand, because I can't do it. I can only do it in limited manner.
So what would that look?
That's a good question. So what I'd like to see that look like. So I have ideas. I have ideas that I would love it if there was some sort of free college counseling software. We weren't overly dependent on things like Naviance. And others. And I'm not trying to disparage products per se, but rather, we have the ability to leverage tech, right? So this is an example of what I was talking about in my speech. So tech exists. We've got tech that can manage these relationships. You don't maybe have access to it, or maybe it doesn't work quite in the right way. But what if we gave that away for free? What if every student in the U.S. and their school had access to a certain degree of tech and a certain degree of technical expertise that would allow them a true exploration of colleges? Now, there's no way to get away from the fact that there's still a human needed, right? And we have to continue to battle the ratios that are just so horrible for students of counselors to what they really need. But the way I make this analogy back at home base is in the context of academic advising. An academic advisor with a stack of papers can effectively advise 100 students. An academic advisor with a robust set of technical tools can advise 500 students with the same quality. So how do we both expand scale and access to the human beings who really need it? And I think we can do that through some free tech that could eventually deconstruct some of that, I'll call the marketing industrial complex that seems to dominate a lot of the admissions offices.
Yeah, if every student had access to a similar platform that would create that profile, they'd be putting their information there.
Possibly.
For the schools to see.
Possibly, yeah. And schools would do less, it's less sort of competition through economics and more a competition through telling a good story.
So I said this would be a moderated discussion, and everyone else really did was just be firing questions. So I will be fair and give you an opportunity if there's things that you want to redirect towards me.
Towards you? Oh, wow. So what do you, okay, so let me turn one question on you that you asked me, and only the one, which is, okay, so how do we change that perception of selectivity and rigor? Where do you start? I think is the way you work.
Yeah, fantastic. Nice softball question. I mean, we start here in this room. We host all of our students 3 times a week for a morning meeting in this space, and we talk about colleges visiting, and we talk about students celebrating their acceptances, and we give announcements about testing updates and different things that are relevant for our students to know. And we don't preface that with any preference.
Okay.
We're not elevating some schools over others. Trying to have that seep into our younger students so that when they get to the end of 11th grade, beginning of 12th grade, they haven't already been tainted by this idea. Now it's tough when families and society put so much emphasis on rankings. We try and continue to spread that message that there's more to a school than what their rankings may suggest. And that's not to say that a highly ranked school isn't a great match.
Absolutely.
For some of our students.
Absolutely.
But really placing that emphasis. When we talk with our students, in the process, we don't necessarily start with where do you want to go to school, but why or what do you want to study. Putting that emphasis on the experience that they'll gain versus the name. So I think those are a big part of it. As counselors, we have a really wonderful situation here to really help our students understand and to embrace our philosophy in that process. But I think it has to start with the students and hope that it then spreads up to the parents. Even parents who've gone to colleges and had that experience come in with their own preconceived notions about it. And it's harder to break that than to take sort of the unmolded mind and start to put some parameters.
I agree with that. I think the language we use is really important in that process. I mean, I've seen school counselors who I respect to the highest degree say things like, "Oh, they went 7 for 7 with acceptances," and I think that's fine. I think that's harmless in its own right. But I do think we run a risk of celebrating the admission offers as the victory in and of itself. You know what I mean? Like, and I struggle with that myself all the time, and I'm really struggling with it with my oldest child. You know, this idea of, you know, sort of the commodification of admissions offers, and that in and of itself has value to a family, versus the commodification of the degree itself and the happiness and the lifelong potential that presents. It's tough. It's very tough because you're sort of swimming upstream against the graduation party announcement, which is, you know, Dave Burge is going to go to X, and there's a stigma that goes along with that.
Certainly, we used to call it the bumper sticker for that.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, we are just about
Okay.
at our time. Do you have any final sage wisdom that you want to share with the group while you still have mostly your own spot?
I do. No, I don't. I guess, you know, by a show of hands, I should have done this at the beginning. How many of you are school counselors? Right. So how many of you are on the college side? And who are the rest of you? Give me some shout outs. What are the groups like? Independent educational consultants, parents?
Teaching faculty.
Teaching faculty. Oh, fantastic. So we got a lot of folks from the school here. Well, that's terrific. I do think that this idea of influence outside of the counseling office and the university side is, what I'm learning is that the stress, even at a school like this, which is so blessed in terms of its college counseling staffing model, even in this context, I have to imagine that you're called upon to provide some of that ad hoc or impromptu, and I know that's yet another thing you're not paid to do per se, but it's a thing that you do because you've got personal connections with these students. And at some point in time during the day, I'd love to hear from you about some of the things, if you're not directly involved in this work, how you perceive this work as a more than casual observer, because you just never know where that influence is going to come with these students. And actually, I think about the number of times my daughter comes home and comments about college X or Y simply because their teacher attended college X or Y, and that's a powerful seat to occupy. And so I don't want to discount that in the dialogue. So thank you for your volunteer work, voluntold work, if you will.
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you again for your opening remarks and then for sitting here with me for a few minutes.
Privilege.
And thank you to all of you who are attending online. I will invite you to rejoin us at 1:15 for our panel discussion. And then for those of you in the room, we will make our way to Parents Hall shortly for lunch. You have all been assigned a table number on the back of your name tag. If you would make your way to that table, there are discussion questions at each table. And our hope is that as you eat and share with the folks at your table, you'll start to think about some of the questions there that may help to create some great questions for our panelists when we regroup here this afternoon. Thank you.